Welcome to the XojoTalk podcast. I am Paul Lefebvre, the Xojo developer evangelist. I have with me this time Wayne Golding, a longtime Xojo user, and he runs Access Direct, a company, an IT company that makes software for a variety of things. And Wayne, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Hi.
Why don't you start by maybe giving us a little bit of background about your company and how you came to use Xojo?
Okay, well, Access Direct was started in 2000, basically as an IT support company. And then from there, we added on disaster recovery solutions. And I needed some way of replicating the data from the client sites to my servers. And at the same time, Xojo was offering free personal copies of Real Basic 5, I think it was then, to Visual Basic 6 users. So I picked up one of those and loved it, and eventually ended up buying bigger and better versions. And so that was running successfully until the supplier of the software also built in FTP. So at that point, I stopped using my Xojo built app and failed over to the supplier's offering, shall we say. So that was my first, commercial use of Xojo at the time. I've used it for multiple other things to do internally, and then a couple of years ago, I started using it to integrate with Xero. That's Xero, Xero.com, which is a New Zealand-built online accounting package with a very good API. And that's what Access focuses on today. We still do the network support and we still do the DR stuff, but I'm focusing on building applications that integrate with Xero, built with Xojo.
Oh, that's interesting. So what type of API do they have that you're connecting using?
We use OAuth 2 to connect to the system, and then it's a very open API, so I can generate invoices and poke them in, generate reports, download the data and generate reports. So very useful. Apparently it's in America as well, but I've never heard of anybody in America ever hearing of it. So.
Yeah, when I was looking at your website, I saw that it was on there. It's very prominent that you talk about how you build stuff that integrates with that. But yeah, I had not heard of it. Although I like, Xero rhymes with Xojo. Oh, that's nice. 4 letters. Coincidence? I don't think so. So the API is like a REST type API? You get back XML or JSON or something?
Yeah, it's REST. Started out using XML, but they've now upgraded it to JSON. So it's just a matter of making requests, getting the data back, or pushing data to it, and getting response.
Yeah, that's what's nice about stuff these days is that's becoming so common that there's almost nothing that Xojo is unable to communicate with, as you get a nice open standard like that.
Very true. Yep.
So your customers are primarily using this on like Windows? Is it enterprise type software?
It's not really enterprise. It's more small business software. I'm developing on Windows, but most of my projects so far have been a desktop project that integrates with the cloud. But obviously, I can also use the Xojo web projects to do a cloud-based version. I have done one of those where the client wanted a browser UI, so it was a standalone web app running on their server, integrating and tying their. It was actually another IT company tying their ticketing system into their Xero accounting system.
Oh, well, that's pretty clever. So that's good. It gives you a little bit of flexibility there to do what, of course, specific customer needs. Now, do you often build, like, I guess the word is bespoke that you use in that part of the world? Or?
Yes, bespoke is what it is, and that's basically what I do.
We tend to say custom or consulting type work here, but
Yeah, no, the company is a bespoke software development company. We don't have a product that we sell as such, although we have had customers that say, okay, well, if we do this, then we'll be able to sell it into our sector. But that's really then becomes a joint venture because they've got the contacts. So,
yeah, that's pretty common. That's a nice business model to have. So you had mentioned briefly that you develop primarily on Windows. I thought we might dive into that a little bit. In our pre-talk, I was mentioning to you that I often have Mac guys that come on the podcast that look down on Windows, and I know on the forum you're like a guy that'll pop up there and say, "Hey, take that back."
Well, Windows has its place as well. I mean, I do have a Mac Mini sitting on my desk, which I do use to test my applications in that environment. I've also got a virtual Linux machine, so I can actually see what it looks like on Mac. But I guess it's a matter of lowest common denominator to a certain extent. Windows is so crappy at graphics that if it works on Windows, it's going to work everywhere else.
Interesting theory.
Well, I don't have all the double buffering issues because I make my applications, I don't put controls on top of controls because I know it looks like crap. So I work around it from the ground up rather than trying to fix it
Right,
later.
yeah. So your design just avoids the problem entirely to start with, and then you don't see it elsewhere, as opposed to us lazy Mac developers. We ignore the problem, and then when it comes time to make a Windows version, we have to repair things.
That's right. And you complain about it.
And then we complain while we're fixing our bad code.
Exactly.
So Windows 10's been out for a couple of years. That's probably the version you run with at this point, or are you still one of those Windows 7 diehards?
No, Windows 10.
Yeah.
I managed to work my way through all of the various iterations, all through the horrible 8s.
Well, you notice I skipped that one because I knew there was no way you would be using that one.
Not anymore, no.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I don't primarily work in Windows anymore, but I've got multiple VMs with Windows, and I love it when a new version comes out because I always jump on it, install it, and play around with it. And Windows 10 was a really nice breath of fresh air. I quickly also switched over my 8 VMs, my primary Windows 8 VMs to Windows 10. I still got a couple Windows 8 ones that I keep for when I need to test something, but I don't start them up too often. Which is kind of a problem when you get VMs, because if you forget to start the thing, for like 6 months.
It's a long time for it to update.
Yeah, you boot that thing, and then it's chugging to check for updates. Then it comes back and it says, you have 3,000 security updates to apply. And then often it just starts doing it. It doesn't ask you. And then you're like, I only needed to test something for 5 minutes, and now I got to wait 5 hours for the updates.
Yeah, well, I think that's a thing about Windows, isn't it? I mean, we had Windows 98, which was okay for what it was. Then they put Millennium out, and that was absolutely abysmal. And, of course, there was Windows XP, which was okay. And then they put Vista out, which was abysmal. And then Windows 7 was good, and the 8s were abysmal. It's like every second generation. I'm not looking forward to Windows 11.
Well, they're never going to do that, right? It's like Windows 10 forever at this point. There's what are they calling the new one that's coming out here in the well, this is what they're calling it. It's like Windows 10 Creators Update Fall Edition or something like that, which is funny because it's fall here and where we are, because it'll be coming out in October, but it's not necessarily fall in all parts of the world.
No.
And then also Microsoft got a little flack for calling it fall in the first place for the season, because also much of the world refers to that season as autumn.
Correct.
So it's just multiple levels of confusion. But Microsoft's naming has always been a little odd. Personally, I never used the older Windows, like the 95 series. I always ran the NT versions. So the first version that I ran was actually NT4, if you remember that way back in the day.
I do remember that one. Yeah, that was an interesting one.
Yeah, that was a fun one because I remember when I was working at the company doing Windows development, I was the only guy that insisted on NT4. Everyone else was okay with running Windows 95. And, back then, not everything worked as well with NT. So I always had
remember the blue screens of death well.
Yeah, there was always these odd little glitches and things like that. But I always stayed with those versions. So I went from Windows NT to Windows, I believe it was Windows 2000. And then I think XP was the one that was after that. So I always used the one. And then the reason I stuck with those is because they're the ones that had the full-blown multitasking.
Yes. Yeah.
The other ones, could run multiple programs at once, but not really well and not really at the same time. And I, as a developer, I kind of always want to run multiple things at once.
I can understand that. When I first started out, I worked for a company called Boss Software. Now, Boss was business operating system came out of the UK. And on an XT computer, we would set up 3 WISE monitors, and we'd have 4 people concurrently using that processor, all through time slicing. But it actually worked really well. And for the time, back in those days, an XT computer would cost you about $10K. So you wanted to get the most out of it.
Right. Yes, the good old days. We can reminisce forever.
We could.
And I don't really, sometimes you think back, that was some of that was fun, but really overall it was kind of awful. The software was terrible. The operating systems were kind of clunky. And
oh, yes.
The hardware was slow and expensive and noisy.
Yep.
Not even remotely portable. But, it was new. It was fun. You played around with it. So, a little while ago, a few weeks at this point, Xojo shipped 2017, release 2. And I thought maybe we'd touch on a little bit about what was in that release. And in particular, I thought we might talk about or let you talk about the feature that was added to that, kind of because of you.
Yes, I think Norman got sick of me asking him about hacking the framework. Back in previous releases, there was these files in the temp extra folder, which have all disappeared now. They had a BEH extension, which was basically the default values of the classes, the Xojo classes. So I was doing things like turning on transparency for labels, for instance, back before transparent labels were default. So I didn't have to remember every time I wanted to make a label, it had to be transparent. And the other thing I was doing was updating the Windows file so that implicit instance was off rather than on, which was another thing that I did, and then I forgot that I didn't turn it on and just made it irritating. So I was hacking the framework, and I think Norman got a little bit upset with me doing that. So he built a new way of me doing it legitimately. And it's an improvement because those files, the overrides files, are outside of the Xojo package environment. So they get applied to new releases without having to be copied over and hacked every time. So there's definite advantage to that. So I have, I've made my adjustments to my various overrides now, and it's improved efficiency very well. The other thing that I really like that's been recently introduced, not in the last release, was the menu editor, where I could set up hotkeys for doing various things. I use a lot of computed properties. So adding Control-Alt-P to add a computed property versus a Control-Shift-P for a standard property is also markedly improved efficiency in coding. And it, to me, shows the maturity of the Xojo IDE when these things are getting added rather than just fixing things that weren't quite working properly.
Right. Yeah, that is a useful feature. I know And particularly for, Windows guys, because I know, we always used to say, well, if you're on the Mac, you can just go to the system settings and add, keyboard shortcuts. But, that didn't help anyone on Windows or Linux. And it still was a little weird to use that menu. And hardly anybody even knows it's there or knows how to use it. So having it built right into the IDE is just a lot easier. And you can find it easier. You can use it easier. And that's, for people who don't know, that's just in the Xojo preferences. I forget which tab it's on off the top of my head. But right in there's a button that says, edit keyboard menu shortcuts or something like that. And you click that and you get a little screen that shows all the Xojo menus, and you can enter what you want for keyboard shortcuts, change the ones that are built in, whatnot. Going back to the feature that Wayne caused to get added, that's we kind of refer to that as the override, the class default value override feature, and that lets you essentially, as Wayne was saying, create kind of not one but multiple, kind of like text files. They are just text files, almost like the ini file format, where for a particular class, Wayne mentioned like a window, you can say, all right, for the window class, I want these properties to have these default values. And you can set, them differently than what Xojo has built in. So Wayne will set implicit instance to off, which is a nice, pro tip for people that can avoid some odd little issues with windows popping up when you don't expect them to. So you can set implicit instance off. You can do, other little things like, maybe change the default size to something that's more appropriate for what you're doing, or change any other property that's on the window so that you don't have to remember after you add a new window, all right, I need to change these 4 properties to what I always use for my particular projects. And now it's a nice supported technique. You just create these text files, throw them in a specific folder. I think in the documents folder is one of the places where you can put them, and you don't get your wrist slapped for hacking things you shouldn't be touching.
Yes, I've had a few posts deleted out of the forum, shall we say, over the years. Norman jumped on them pretty quick. Another thing that may be useful with that technique, which I haven't actually tried myself, is that things like buttons on the Raspberry Pi, the writing is quite low on the button, and you can actually adjust the height per platform through the defaults file. So I was wondering about making the button a bit taller so that the writing was more centered. But like I said, I haven't tried it, so I don't know if that would work.
Well, the defaults thing supposedly has a way to set a value for each OS platform.
That's right. Yes, it does. Yeah.
So
and if you look at a button, at a standard button, you'll see that there are 3 numbers for the height.
Right, but it would be, you'd be using the generic Linux one for the Pi, so it would apply to regular Linux and the Pi version of Linux. But that would allow you to set, say, a taller button height, because with GTK3, the theming is read a little differently, and some of the buttons aren't quite tall enough to fit the text that you set for the button, which is a little irritating. I know William is still looking into that to see if there's some way that we can get the right theme information back so that we can maybe tweak that. But Linux is kind of a bag of hurt at times, as they say.
Yeah, I mean, that company, the IT company that I did the project for a few years ago, there was one guy there who was using Linux on his laptop. And when he went into it, I noticed that all the fields were too short for the data that was there. Just that was the way it was working. So, and he didn't care. It wasn't a problem for him because apparently all of them do that.
He uses Linux. He's used to odd things like that.
Exactly.
Well, I know we've got in the examples for Xojo, there is an example project that shows you how to read some theme setting and get like the default height of a control so that you could set it in code. But that does have the downside of, well, I mean, that could affect your layout if all of a sudden controls are, growing in size. Things could end up on top of each other or something like that. So it's not kind of a silver bullet, but if you get the space in your layout for controls to maybe get a little larger when they run on Linux, that can be an option. I think on the Eddie's Electronics example, I I have the button. I think I might have the button subclassed, and then if it's on Linux, I programmatically increase its height.
Oh, okay. Yep. So long as you, as you say, so long as you've got the space to do it. Yeah.
Right. You got to have the space to do it in your layout design. And then, if Linux is a target, you need to, make sure you're doing, then, creating subclasses for the controls you commonly use and having them do that might be an option that could save you a little bit of work. I'm still monkeying around with Linux myself. Today, I actually rebuilt my Raspberry Pi using the latest version of the OS. Raspbian Stretch is what it's called now. And
okay.
I just downloaded that and figured out how to rebuild the flash drive using the image, which the steps seem entirely... I had to use a different program than I used the first time when I set it up like a year or so ago. I don't know what happened to the old program. It seemed like it disappeared off the internet. Like weird. But it was just some open source program that could read the Raspbian image and then rebuild the flash SD card. And... because apparently there's no, this is again a Linux thing, but apparently there's no supported way to upgrade from the old version, which was called Jesse, to the new version, which is called Stretch. So you can't just click something in a window and say, upgrade me to the new version. They had some command line stuff you could do, one of which involved editing some system file with, paths to things it downloaded so that it would download the new version stuff instead of the old stuff. And I said, you could try this. It might work, but if it doesn't, And I was like, you know what? My Pi's primarily is for testing. I'm just going to rebuild it.
Yeah, I would do the same thing.
And of course, if I had another tiny little, it uses one of those micro SD cards. So if I had another one of those, I would have just, swapped them as needed, I suppose. But I didn't have another one handy. So I just rebuilt the 32 gig one I had. And it seemed to go smoothly enough. The new version ran fine, had a few new features over the other version, which helped with like remote connections and stuff. So I'm still testing that. Got it just working a few hours ago.
Oh, cool.
Those are fun things to play with, us nerds always looking for excuses to play with technology. So.
True enough. Well, I've got a Pi sitting on my desk as well, and every now and then I get a bit of spare time and fire it up and have a play. But as I'm a Windows developer, it doesn't work that well yet from Windows. Remote debugging, the breakpoints just don't work from Pi to Windows. Oh,
the remote debugging from Windows to Pi. So is it not stopping on the breakpoints?
Yeah, it just totally ignores them. Yeah.
Oh, so they don't break. They're breakless points.
Breakless points, that's the one.
Yeah, that doesn't sound as useful. I mean, I suppose it's a little convenient because you can just run from the IDE, so it's slightly more convenient than building and transferring. But not being able to see your breakpoints is less than useful.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I presume that you have created a case on that, so we must know of that, although even if I didn't.
Yes, you do know of that, and I'm suspecting it'll be fixed when the 64-bit debugger finally arrives for Windows as well. So.
I bet there's something related to that's monkeying up the works. That has been a little bit that's been causing our 64-bit support on Windows to drag behind both Mac and Linux. Is just that the tool set we're using, LLVM and I think parts of LLDB for the debugger and some other stuff, are open source projects, but their Windows porting stuff is always a little lagging behind Mac and Linux. So we got to wait for those open source guys to get to the Windows stuff, and once they do, we can grab it and then integrate it back into Xojo, but it never seems to be ready at the same time as Mac and Linux, which is irritating.
I guess it would be, but then Mac is Linux-based, isn't it? So
right,
get both
yeah. Yeah, it seems like they're focusing on Mac. I mean on Linux stuff, and you kind of get both for the price of one, I guess. So.
Yep. And they'll be geeks, so they're focusing on Linux.
Well, yeah, jumping from Linux to Windows a little bit, the newer versions of Windows 10 have that new Linux subsystems that's in there. Have you used that at all? Or?
I've had a play with the Bash shell, yeah. Had a play, that's about it.
Yeah, I played with it too, and it turned out it could actually run Xojo Linux apps in that bash shell on Windows.
Oh, okay.
But only if they're compiled for 64-bit. The bash shell, apparently, I only tested a 64-bit version of Windows now that I think about it. But I guess it doesn't have any sort of 32-bit compatibility. I didn't try a 32-bit version of Windows at this point to see what it does. But the 64-bit Linux Xojo apps ran under that bash shell. Console apps. It can only run console apps right now.
Yeah.
That's the Windows thing. It's only a console subsystem. But it's just weird. I mean, yeah, Windows has some version of Ubuntu Linux embedded in it for some reason, so you can run Linux command line tools and somehow get to the Windows file system, but there's this other Linux file-ish system. It's crazy.
Sort of makes you wonder why, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's hard to follow what Microsoft's thinking there, but like anything else, like you said, you have a play with it. It's kind of fun. You see that in there, and you're like, ooh, a new little thing here to monkey around with and see what it does.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it was something to do with Hyper-V. I mean, all my virtual machines run on Hyper-V, and Linux ones work well on there, so maybe it's to do with that.
That I do not know. All right, well, I kind of maybe briefly mentioned it offhand as we were talking earlier, but Wayne gets the prize for being literally halfway across the world from me. He's in New Zealand, and if you couldn't tell from the fact that he has a much cooler accent than I do. And obviously that also means he's the farthest virtual podcast guest I've had. Not that it matters, because this is 2017 and we can do everything on the internet, including video chats for podcasts. But Wayne, why don't you tell us a little bit about the wonderful land of New Zealand that everyone always says, where I'd like to go is that beautiful, beautiful place. What's it like out there? It's a whole other world to those of us in the U.S., which isn't necessarily known for being beautiful everywhere.
Well, I don't know if New Zealand's beautiful everywhere, but if you can imagine a country that's basically the same land mass as the UK, but with 4.5 million people in it, you start to see that we've got a lot of farms, a lot of countryside. There are places where you can snow ski in the afternoon and then catch a trout at the end of the day in a lake. And you're in your bathing suit, basically. It's warm enough to
Wow.
And that's it's about a half an hour by car between the two. So in the middle of the North Island, there was a huge volcano, and I mean huge. If you look on the map and see Lake Taupo, that's the caldera. So, and it's got lots of mountains around it. So that's basically Lake Taupo is huge, and then we've got two mountains just to the south of it with ski fields on. The Lord of the Rings, of course, was made in New Zealand. And I've been trying to get Jeff to have an XTC down at in Middle Earth for a couple of years, but it seems to be a bit of a big ask.
So you heard it here first in the podcast. Wayne is proposing the next XTC to be in Middle Earth. That'd be a great theme.
Would be.
Start the hashtags on Twitter for that to get the ball rolling.
We should do. It's about time you guys moved it out of the States anyway, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, next year we're moving it to a mountain in Denver. I guess Denver's kind of in a mountain, I guess. I haven't been to Denver myself yet, but so I mean, maybe that's a start. But yeah, we haven't taken it out of the country yet. I do know there's been one conference that's been held in Europe that we've sent some Xojo staff to in the past, but we haven't put on a conference yet in Europe.
Well, if they're already having conferences over there, you don't need to have yours over there. You can come down here.
There you go. I'm all for that. Although I hear the flight requires going over a fair amount of ocean.
Well, it's only 12 hours to get across the Pacific.
Yeah, sleep it off, I guess.
Yeah, it's not too bad. What is it? It's about 17, 18 hours to New York. Something like that. I know it takes 24, 27 to get to London. I had to go to London direct once. That was a hell of a flight.
Wow, that's a whole day. Which, to point out, as Wayne told me when we started this thing, he's actually talking to me from tomorrow. It's the next day where he is, so that's just really weird. I'm not entirely sure what date I'll be able to put on this podcast, I guess, when I post it.
Could be a problem for you, I suppose.
Yeah, you never know. Well, speaking of XTC, before we wrap up, I wanted to do a little spiel about it, remind people that XTC 2018 is coming up. It's in April of 2018, as I mentioned, in Denver, Colorado. And the early release pricing ends at the end of September. So if you're listening to this podcast, it's still not the end of September. So you have some time. If you're thinking of coming, sign up, save yourself a little bit of money. Dana's been telling everybody here that flights are pretty cheap right now. Maybe not from New Zealand, but around the country, maybe from Europe, they're pretty cheap. So booking a flight now, if you're thinking of coming, might be also another way that you can reduce costs. So definitely check that out. That's xojo.com/XDC. There's some stuff up there, and the schedule of sessions, maybe not the schedule, but the list of sessions with all the descriptions and stuff will be appearing very soon. It might actually be up by the time this podcast gets posted. So you can check there and see who's going to be talking and what they're going to be talking about. And I know a lot of people sometimes want to see what the session topics are before they sign up. So do head on over and check that out. Well, Wayne, I want to thank you very much for being on XojoTalk and taking some time away from the future to talk to me.
It's been a pleasure, Paul.
Have a great day, everyone.